Hi again. Another very useful way to use exchanges is to get a draw whenever we have a bad position. There are many ways on which we can draw a game, so I will start with the most direct way on which we can force a draw by exchanging pieces, which is to reach a position on which there is insufficient material to give a checkmate. So let's start with this position. Here we see that black is a pawn down and this pawn is on g6, just 2 squares away from promoting. So black has to be careful here. Black cannot just play any move. For example, playing the move rook to b6, if black just wants to wait. This would be bad because white would give a check, and then king to f8 is not possible because we get this nice checkmate. And after king to d8, white can give a check, and if the king goes to c7 or to e7, we get the same situation. White will get this very strong move, knight to d5, giving a check and attacking the rook, and white will win the game. King to d8 here would be stronger, but then white can play the move knight to f6, planning to move the rook and then promote the pawn. And if black ever gives the bishop for the pawn, here in this particular position, this is a draw, but this is a draw with best play. So a rook can normally defend against a rook and a knight, but black has to play precisely here. So here black can make a mistake and can lose the game. Although with best play, this should be a draw. But in these positions on which we don't have many pieces on the board, we should always be alert about exchanging as many pieces as we can and reaching a position on which there's not enough material to give a checkmate. That's why here in this position, black played the move rook takes g6, which is the best way to take because we give a check, so it's very forcing. We also attack the rook. That's why here white has to take, and after taking and king takes, the players here agreed to a draw because this is a position on which there's no way to give a checkmate. So whenever we have a king and a knight or a king and a bishop against a king, the game is a draw and there's no way that black can go wrong here. So the game ended in a draw after king takes g6. Another way to get a draw whenever we have a bad position by exchanging pieces is to reach a stalemate position. So for sure, if we can exchange pieces in a bad position to reach a stalemate, that would be great. Probably that will not happen very often because our opponent will try to avoid exchanges that will allow us to reach a stalemate in a bad position. But sometimes these stalemate ideas can appear after an exchange. So as usual, we should always evaluate exchanges and to see what happens after the exchange because we get a new situation on the board, because we have less pieces on the board. Let's evaluate this position. Here white is 2 pawns down, but additionally black is trying to attack white's king. In the game white tried queen to e3, but after rook to a8, the game ended shortly because black is just planning to attack white's king, so this is just a very bad position for white. Instead, in this position, white missed a brilliant opportunity to save the game that would have started with an exchange. And the point was to trade rooks, after which black has to take the rook because giving a check first wouldn't work because white would just keep the extra material. So after taking the rook, here we get this new position, and probably if white, who is a very strong player, was given this position, he would probably find this idea. And the idea was to reach a stalemate position by sacrificing the rook and the queen. So here comes the very nice rook to g3, giving a check, and this rook has to be taken. If the king goes to the h file, then queen to g7 is going to be a checkmate. And if black plays king to f8, then white will be the one attacking black's king. King to e8 would lose after rook to g8, which is a checkmate. And after queen to e7, white can simply play rook to g8, giving the rook, but after queen takes e7, white gets a decisive material advantage. That's why after rook to g3, this rook has to be taken. And we see that now white's king doesn't have any squares anymore because all the squares around the king are controlled by the queen or the rook. That's why here white has a very strong way to draw the game. Giving the queen straight away, for example queen to h8, would not work because black wouldn't capture with the king but with the rook. And now we don't get a stalemate anymore because the king can go to e2. But instead, white can play queen to b8, which is probably the hard move to find. And after king to g7, then white will sacrifice the queen after queen to g8. If the king goes to h7, queen to h8 would also lead to stalemate. And here again black has to take because otherwise white will capture the queen. That's why after king takes g8, we get this very nice stalemate position. So this was a very nice idea to reach a stalemate that will start with an exchange. Another common way to draw a game is by giving regular checks, what we call perpetual checks. That's why when having a bad position, we should look out for exchanges in order to reach a position on which we can give perpetual checks. In this position, white is doing very bad. White is 2 pawns down and black is attacking white's pieces. This knight is very powerful, attacking the rook and the bishop. But white find a brilliant way to reach a perpetual check by going for some uneven exchanges. First in this position, white played the very nice bishop takes f5. And after queen takes, here comes the second very nice move. Queen takes e7. We give a check and we plan to give a checkmate. That's why black has to take the queen. So white gave material in these exchanges, but white saw this idea of giving a perpetual check after rook to g7. So here black can only play king to h8. And after rook to g1, the players agreed to a draw, because after king to h7, white will simply give checks and keep the rook on the g-file. Black can play the move d4, but after taking the pawn, then white will still continue giving checks. So this is a draw because there's no way that black can progress. By the way, in this position, white shouldn't be greedy and play the move rook to f7, because after king to g8, although white can take the queen, black will capture the rook, having an extra piece. Or playing rook takes e7 would also be bad in this case, because the king can now escape these checks. After king to g8, rook to g7, black will simply play king to f8 and have a decisive material advantage. And last, I want to mention another more advanced drawing technique, which is to go for a position on which, even though our opponent has a material advantage, there's no way to progress. This is what we call a fortress. So in this position, here white has 2 bishops and 2 pawns against a rook and a pawn, so white has a material advantage. White is trying to progress to attack black's pawn. So this position might look a bit hard to defend as black, but here black found a forcing way to make a draw by going for this exchange after playing the move rook takes e7. And after king takes e7, here we have a fortress. And the main point is that white cannot promote any of these pawns if they are on the h-file in this case, because white has a light square bishop and the promotion square, which is h8, is a dark square bishop. So in this case, you should be familiar with this type of fortress, which is a very specific one. The most common way to get this fortress is just with a pawn and the bishop. So this is even a more complicated version of this fortress. But again, this is a more advanced idea, and in fact this is a world championship match. And black still has to be a bit careful in this position, because here playing the move g6, for example, would be very bad, because white will not capture with the bishop, which would be a draw because we still get the fortress. So in these positions, no matter how many pawns white has on the h-file, there's no way that white can promote the pawn, because whenever white tries to promote the pawn, we'll get a stalemate. But in this case, white will just take with the h-pawn, and now this pawn will promote because the king will support the pawn and the bishop will control the promotion square. That's why g6 is really bad, but black will simply wait with the king. The king will come to g8, h8 or h7, depending on where white's bishop goes. And the game continued bishop to d3, king to h8. And after king to f8, the king doesn't have any more moves, but in this particular position, black can play the move g5, just planning to take here. And if white takes, as it happened in the game, in this particular position, we get a stalemate. So black, who is a very strong player, went for this exchange in order to reach this very nice fortress. So exchanges are not the only, but an important way to try to force a draw. So keep in mind this idea of exchanging pieces whenever you have a bad position to get a draw by reaching positions on which there's not enough material to give checkmate, to get a stalemate, to give a perpetual check, or to reach a fortress.